This is the module that kind of connects us from the older medieval period to the medieval period that is most interesting in the Western mystery tradition, because it deals starting with the Knights Templar and moving forward into the traditions of alchemy and many other kinds of things, the Rosicrucians and the Hermetic Renaissance and so on. So it's kind of long. I'm going to go rather quickly over a lot of things that really require an awful lot more attention, but this is just an overview of the material. Now, the Knights Templar were founded in AD, in the century, the very beginning of the 12th century, by two Frenchmen. And these were not poor people, they were all nobility, but Hugh de Payan and Geoffrey de Saint-Omer. And their idea was to defend the pilgrims' routes to Jerusalem from the Muslims. There was a route by land from Europe, and there was one by sea to the port of Jaffa, which is near modern Tel Aviv. And they wanted to do something that knights had never really done before. Knights had followed the chivalric orders, which they were the wealthy children of wealthy parents who were nobility. But knights were really quite not necessarily moral at all. A knight had tremendous power. It was just like when you were a knight with a horse and full armor, you were about like today you would be in a Humvee that was fully armed or something like that. Nothing could withstand. And there was a lot of abuse of this sort of thing. And the code of chivalry, which was to protect the weak and all this sort of thing, which is lionized in the Arthurian legends and so on, was not something that really ruled much of anything in Europe. These people wanted to undertake not only carry on the chivalric rules, but to also undertake monastic vows of poverty and chastity. And so the symbol of their poverty, the two founders mounted upon their one horse, became a symbol of the Knights Templar. This is one of the symbols we see, two knights mounted on one horse, because they took vows of poverty, and at first they were very poor. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The Temple of Solomon was in Jerusalem, and when they came to Jerusalem, they stayed on the mountain where the Temple of Solomon supposedly had been. Now, that was part of the territory. It was the token territory that had been turned over to the last of the Merovingian families that had been overturned by the Carolingians, by Charlemagne. So the Merovingian families that had never claimed a bloodline to Jesus, but had claimed a bloodline to the gods and this sort of thing, were given a sort of token rulership over this little space in Jerusalem, and it was called the Priory of Zion, Mount Zion. So this is the kind of symbol we find on lots of their emblems that we find from the Knights Templar, the symbol of their poverty and their chastity. The two knights on one horse. Also the fleur-de-lis, usually a red cross associated with what is called the red cross pate, which has an elongated lower limb, and then three fleur-de-lis things on the end, and that came in all kinds of variations that represented the Knights Templar. The Grand Master was Hugh de Payan, and it grew wealthy in later years because people died. They left their wealth to the order. They were protecting pilgrims. What they were doing was something that many people would be very, very grateful to, and it was religious. So they grew wealthy the same way the church grew wealthy, by people willing things to them after they died. So they got donations of land and money, and they eventually were divided into orders like serving brothers, who were just sort of lay members of the community who would live in certain places and take care of their needs and their wants. There were bankers who worked for them, and chaplains who worked for them, and so on. And there were knight commanders of the different regions, all still under the Grand Master. They built forts to defend the pilgrim routes, and they built all the major cathedrals of Europe. They were patronized by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, he was an abbot of the Cistercian order, the Cistercians were reformers of the Benedictine order, which was part of the whole same reform movement that Protestantism was doing, because the monastic orders had become very corrupt. They had prostitutes serving them, and they were gaining lots of money and wealth and eating big banquets and doing things like that. And so the same movement that Protestantism arose from was part of the movement that the reform of the orders came from. And Bernard established scores of new Cistercian monasteries, and one of his monks eventually became pope. But St. Bernard himself was more influential than the Pope, and so anything he wanted, he was considered to be the great saint of the day. And he wrote a rule for the Knights Templar that established them as the first monastic order of Christian warriors. And this transcended the chivalric code to a spiritual form of knighthood. They were now holy warriors, one could say, but not in quite the same sense as jihad. And again, their job was to protect, it was a defensive job, to protect travelers. And St. Bernard convinced the Pope to grant the status of a religious order, which gave them certain kinds of exemptions, certain kinds of support, and also they made an obeisance to the Pope. This was the era of the Crusades, the attempt to regain papal control of Jerusalem. It was also attempts to gain papal control of today what we call Germany and a lot of other places where it didn't work because people fought against it. And the Knights Templar were very fierce warriors because they were bolstered by their spirituality, and they performed very heroically in battle, even though their numbers were very small at first. And they earned the respect not only of Europe but of their enemies. And the enemies were Islamic chivalric orders, because chivalric orders existed in all societies. And they developed diplomatic and collegial relations with Islam. And we're told that wounded Knights Templar were nursed back to health and returned by many of the Muslim enemies because there was that much respect between them, and an awful lot of other kinds of diplomatic relations existed.
Lewis?
Yes.
Before you change that, you've got a typo, so they were retuned by the Muslims? And
Yeah, thank you. I'll come back and fix that.
you want that word.
They were considered to be the protectors of the pilgrims. This is a sort of a line drawing of what a 13th century Templar would look like. He's got the red cross pate and so on, and he has lots of armor now because they've got a lot of money now. They're getting pretty wealthy, and they were able to build incredibly massive forts, a lot of which still exist, along the trade routes to protect pilgrims and places where people could run in and hide from bands of Saracens and other people that were chasing them and so on. And these were built in the classic ways of defended forts with places to pour boiling oil down on people and all that kind of stuff, you know. Many of them survive. They also, though, were initiated into Middle Eastern mysteries, some of them alchemical and esoteric Christianity. I'll explain a little about that. Hugh du Payan was made a bishop according to the Charter of Arminius, which seems to be a historical document written in the charter, the part of the charter that quotes that has the Greek document testifying to this is in very authentic Greek from this period, by the Archbishop, again misspelling, I'll fix, Theokletos. Now they were the anti-church. They were the church that existed in place of the state church, the Byzantine state church. They were we call them today Johannites. They were the same church supposedly was founded by Mary Magdalene and St. John. And they had existed in Asia Minor and the same places that were ruled by the Byzantine churches without being persecuted because they had such respect of the people. It was out of them that the desert fathers and desert monks that went to Egypt originally came, and they were existing until about the time of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And this relationship with them that I am positing was quite historical because it's been stated that it is, and there's some other indications it might be. According to this document, they received the valid apostolic succession. Probably they learned the veneration of the Shroud of Turin, which is the Mandylion, from this source, and I'm going to show you how that worked in a little while. This is one line drawing of the Mandylion. The Mandylion was the Shroud of Turin. It seems to be the Shroud of Turin folded in such a way as to show only the face, and then that was shown in public, and that was up all the time at St. Sophia and taken out for people to as a great relic of Christianity for people to worship at various times. They also had diplomatic interactions with Islam, which resulted in contacts with Islamic mysticism and initiatic schools and alchemical schools, because remember the Islamic scholars and people had taken over the Pythagorean schools and the Pythagorean information from what we now call Akhnim, and they were now very actively involved in alchemical research and also alchemical mysticism. And Gnostic philosophy, which went along with this whole thing. This is an image that's associated with the Knights Templar called the Baphomet. This is actually a Gnostic image. It can be attributed to several of the Gnostic versions of deity, but it's full of alchemical symbols. Of course, to the medieval Roman Christians, it would be a symbol of the devil. But of course, if they looked at any of the symbols you might have of Tibetan Buddhism and other kinds of things today, they'd say the same thing. And when they were accused of heresy, the Knights Templar, and of devil worship, it was on the basis of their having worship of a head. And that's an interesting subject we'll talk a little bit more about. But we find, for example, even on the some of the coins and some of the other things, the symbols of the Templars, there were pictures of a head, a very interesting head with what seemed to be a sort of split beard at the bottom, etc. And these are not pictures of Jacques de Molay or of any of the Grand Masters. These are mysterious pictures of a head that are not explained at all. And we find later in places like Rosslyn Chapel and so on that were built by Templars.
Louis, I have a question. You mentioned cathedrals and Rosslyn Chapel built by Templars. Did they also employ stonemasons to do this building, or did the Knights do the building?
No. The Knights they had a very cozy relationship with the building trades, which existed in France and later in England and other places. In France, especially in France, and so they patronized the building trades, and they had so much money, they built cathedrals on behalf of the Pope and people like that and oversaw them because they had the connections to oversee that kind of work. When they were not at war in the Crusades, they were in the building business. First it was building forts, and then it became building great cathedrals on behalf of the Pope, and they oversaw them. These cathedrals are still amazing modern things that have really amazing acoustical properties and light properties, and you can go and visit some of them and see what they're like. Very often people record concerts and things in these cathedrals because of the qualities of the sound. And they were basically the high-tech sound and intoning, and it was more than that. This is at the time that Gregorian chant started to become used and so on, and all this was done in these very resonant cathedrals that would focus sound in certain areas and so on. And then were built with these purposes in mind. It took a couple of generations to build them. But I want to talk now about the Shroud of Turin. Excuse me, because the Shroud of Turin, is supposed to be the historical shroud of Jesus. What we're looking at here is the entire length of the shroud that would have wrapped the body of Jesus. Those big triangular shaped things are patches that were sewn after there was a fire at one time, and molten mercury dripped onto it, so they're not part of really the image on the shroud. But you can see an image at the front and back of a man whose arms are crossed, who's in a death pose. And this part is the face. This is what the face looks like. It just looks kind of like a smudge to people. It's only through the invention of modern photography that we were able to find out that this face was in fact a negative image of a positive face. So if we take a photograph of this and then look at the negative of the photograph, we will see the things that are really on the shroud. Here's the whole body seen through a negative photograph. Here's the face seen through the negative of the face. And here are the hands seen through a negative. In fact, it's almost like an X-ray. You can see bones and things like that. It's a very amazing thing. And it's not something that any forger could have possibly come up with, because it's got too much very advanced science in it. In fact, a lot of science we don't even understand yet to explain these images. And for example, you might notice that the hands have nail holes in them, but they don't have them in the palms, they have them in the wrists. And it was until this time always Jesus was painted as having nails through his palms, which we know now if had been done would just rip through his fingers and he would have fallen off. And there's a whole lot of details about crucifixion that are encrypted onto this document, just like we can learn about dinosaurs from their bones. There may be 50 different parameters of things you can learn just from reading bones and reading things from fossilized bones. They're not even bones anymore, they're just rock. And you can still learn a lot about things. And it's the same thing with the shroud. Well, what's important about the shroud is that the Knights Templar, during the time when Byzantine Empire fell and the Muslim invasions came in and took over a lot of things in Constantinople, the Knights Templar went on a crusade to battle for freeing the city. And at that time, the city was in shambles, and they made off with the Mandylion. And that's when it disappeared. The Knights Templar were there, and then it disappeared. And it shows up later, a couple centuries later, when the widow of the second in command, after the order has been totally decimated by the Inquisition, the widow of the second in command has to sell this shroud, what we now call the Shroud of Turin, which people now feel was the Mandylion, and explains the head that they were worshiping and so on. And so it's not been difficult to eventually establish a connection between the Shroud of Turin, which is not a forgery, and the Mandylion, which existed beforehand. And the Mandylion was venerated because it had been supposedly brought by Mary Magdalene. She was one you even read in the gospel stories. She takes the shroud, she picks it up, and she leaves. But where does she end up? She ends up in Asia Minor with the young John. And that is the founding of the Johannite Church. And the relic ends up in the hands of the state church and becomes one of the greatest relics of the time. And people contemplate it, they sit before it. Let's take a look at how we would do that. We're going to stare at the shroud image, and then we're going to close our eyes. But I want you to keep your eyes fixed on this as long as I tell you to, before you close your eyes. Here's the image of the shroud as it might have appeared in a darkened room where people were venerating it. And if you focus your attention just in the center of the nose, where I put a little bit of a round thing you can sort of see, about at that point, about where almost the two crosses seem to come together. It's in the upper part of the bridge of the nose. Just focus there. So keep your eyes wide open and just look there. Keep looking there. Stare at it. If you have to blink, you can blink, but keep staring at that same spot. Look at it. We're going to count backwards from 20. Keep staring. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now close your eyes. Even put your hands over them for a moment so you block out all light. Did anybody see anything? It's very difficult to do, and sometimes you have to do it a few times to get it right.
There's a white cross.
If you do it correctly, you'll see the negative image of the face of Jesus, which is the actual positive image.
That happened when I was staring at it with
Yeah.
eyes open.
People will, well, no, that doesn't really happen. What happens is the way your eyes work is when you look at a negative image long enough and then you close your eyes, you'll see the positive image, and vice versa. Now, on a computer, this works real well. On the wall, it may not work so well. So,
We also had so much other light in here too.
yeah, we have a lot of lights on. But in a darkened room, this is the way that the face of Jesus really was seen by people in ancient times, by this technique of focusing on the face of the shroud and under the right light conditions and so on. And people might be there worshiping it for a long period of time and then close their eyes and very surprised to suddenly find out that the whole face, the face of a wise man appears to them. And this is probably the secret veneration of the shroud, not the kind of veneration that was done when it was taken out to big crowds and everybody looks at it, but that was done secretly by people who knew the secret of the shroud, that you could actually see a positive image but they didn't know what a positive image was. It was just a magical thing that would appear. So if people are doing this on a computer, I've experimented with it on a computer, it works very well, but it doesn't work very well on the wall here. But if you want to go take a look at the program and try it, you'll find that it works very well, and you see a very amazing sort of violet blue image of the face that you see. That's the Shroud of Turin face. That's the negative image that you always see today, which is what nobody had ever seen before except when they close their eyes. Does that make sense?
So it moved violet.
Yeah. So yes, they built churches, they built cathedrals, they had very close relations with the building crafts. Excuse me. And these included the companions, the French companions, who were early, they were Freemasons, stonemasons. They had among them architects and things like this. The design of a great Gothic cathedral like this would have been undertaken using sacred geometry. It would all grow from, it would be done ad quadratus, which means from the rectangle, and then the Pythagorean chord from end to end would be taken, and on that would be built something else. It would all grow mathematically from one thing, and that was what sacred geometry was about. And it could be done from a square, from a rectangle. It's even done from other points, but sacred geometry isn't used anymore, but it was at that time. And so the design, the basic overall design of these things was overseen by the Templars themselves, and then the architects, all the grades, the master masons all the way down to the grunts that did the rock chipping, put this all together. These often involved hauling in huge amounts of sand and things in order to build it. If you ever look into how these cathedrals were built, it's very amazing how all this was done. And many of these things still survive today. The insides of them, they have very high vaulted ceilings, and they have sound characteristics. They were always designed to be put at the crossroads of underground water, which you could get by dowsing and things like this, and or on what we call ley lines, which are lines that are drawn from constellations of stars on the earth or other means that are used to create them. On Friday the 13th of the year in which they had perhaps their greatest power, there were no more crusades. They were mainly involved now in banking and building, and there was a lot of wealth, and there were people that were. It really rivaled the Roman Catholic Church as a big institution. They had their own clerics, meaning people that worked in clerical jobs. That's what a cleric was. The collar I wear today is still part of that whole sort of thing, and Christian clothes. It's part of being part of the government, and being a government employee, I think, is another way of putting it. And it rivaled all this. And this was a time when there was more than one pope, there were anti-popes. There were people vying for the position of the papacy. And Philip the Fair of France had his own candidate for Pope. And he and the Pope in Rome wanted to get the money from these people because they were extraordinarily wealthy. And so it was decided that they would dig up all the dirt they could on them, and there was all kinds of rumors that they were involved in secret initiatic rites that were not Christian and all kinds of other things. And so in one fell swoop on Friday the 13th, all the major players in among the Knights Templar had soldiers come to their doors about 2 in the morning, wake them out of bed, and pull them into prison. And the whole court of the Inquisition and the torture weapons of the Inquisition and everything were employed to elicit confessions from them that they had been doing Satan worship and that they were anti-Christian and all this sort of thing. And many of them eventually, after months of torture and things in which they didn't die, they were just completely defeated, confessed to just about anything they wanted to confess to. And we still have all the records of these trials and what they supposedly confessed to. And this was in order to get public support for wiping out the order and for the government and the papacy taking over all their land and their money and all this sort of thing. The head of the order was Jacques de Molay, and the second in command was a man who had in possession, took in his possession, one thing that he had was the Shroud of Turin, which his wife kept. And at the same time, there were several ships full of Templars that escaped out into the ocean. And some went to Portugal, some went to Scotland. These were places that did not have diplomatic relations with the French, and they would not be able to be gotten from them. So there was warning in advance, some advance warning. Some were warned, some were not. And there's a whole lot of very interesting history behind this. But Jacques de Molay, who was the Grand Master, was eventually burned at the stake with his second in command. And the story goes that he cursed the Pope and he cursed Philip the Fair, and within so many months after this, they both died horrible deaths and of horrible diseases and things like this, or accidents. But the question about whether the proper lineage was passed down to continue the Knights Templar has always been a major issue. The Charter of Larmenius says that it was passed in prison from de Molay to a fellow named Larmenius, but that isn't really a correct way to pass the lineage, because it had to be done by vote of everybody. It couldn't just be handed over like a bishop making another bishop or something. And so that's been challenged. So everybody says the line died, but there's another secret history which I have in the written about in the Initiatic Mysteries, in Initiation into the Grail Mysteries. That is another part of the story that's very interesting, in that a few years after this, a lot of Templars came back, and the new Pope, after Philip the Fair was dead, and the new anti-Pope was very sympathetic to all this stuff, and he in fact was made the Grand Master of the order. And there's a lot of evidence that he was elected properly by a quorum of brothers and all this sort of thing. So we don't know about what all that is, but today, if you know in Freemasonry, we have a degrees of Knights Templar, and we have also a young men's organization called the de Molays, named after Jacques de Molay. And the connection now between the Knights Templar and what the esoteric knowledge that they accrued, and the building trades, which were not esoteric at all until they started messing around with the Knights Templar. Who knows what could happen? Like the guy said, when the hippies moved into the bummy section of town and all the bums got hip, it was sort of like that. And this is the kind of connection that happens. There are very clear connections that go on after this time of persecution between the building trades and the secret Templars that survive. So this is a little diagram of the ship that leaves, and the ships that leave with supposedly great treasure and things like that, probably as much money as they could get. And they went to different places and established themselves. However, another thing to know about the Templars is that there was a very strong revenge element in the Templars against the French government and against the papacy, that you will find that it's so powerful it is continued through the Freemasonic members of Freemasonry and the development of Freemasonry, and it finally becomes something that is even basic to the French Revolution many centuries later, the revenge of the Templars. And but at the time, many of the Templars who not only were masters of the land, but also of the sea, because they defended the sea routes, committed acts of piracy against the ships of the French government and the papal ships. And they used as their symbol a skull, and just a skull, not crossbones, but just the skull. And they were called, their ships are called corsairs. Much later, in some of the really early writings we have that talk about the oaths that were taken in Freemasonry, one of the things that people say is, I am a corsair, I am a pirate, and so on. But apparently that kind of piracy went on after this time into the 14th century and the 15th century. The whole history of piracy is very interesting.
But this piracy was selective, though. I mean,
Yes,
they didn't just
yeah.
hit anybody who had
Yeah.
money. They were very targeted.
Oh, they targeted. This is a symbol of the skull and crossbones, a Templar skull and crossbones from a Templar gravesite. And we still, in French Freemasonry, you still contemplate this symbol. This is a very important symbol. I think it's come out of English Freemasonry, and Americans were so anti-pirate, for good reasons, that they would not use this kind of a symbol. So here we have all these strains that are contributing towards all kinds of things that are wanting to be synthesized, but they're not really synthesized yet. So Protestant mysticism kind of brings together a lot of things that are happening. But now we have the Johannite mysticism from Asia Minor that is going to have a strong influence on the Knights Templar. And this is a form of Christianity, but it's a very different kind of Christianity than you would find in Roman Catholicism. And then you have the Masonic guilds, which are the building guilds that are carrying on the the Roman building trades, but they've been chased out of Rome and they're living up in the Alps in communities called at Lake Como, the Comocene community. And they're working now with the Knights Templar, the French companions and the Freemasonic guilds, and this relationship forms between them that becomes one of dependency. The Knights depend upon the companions depend upon the Knights. What do you think is going to happen when the Knights are squashed by the Inquisition? Their old buddies are going to help them. They do assist them. They help them in many ways. And then the Arab Hermetic sciences have been brought in through the Hermetic Renaissance, which we'll be talking about, and Christian forms of Kabbalah. And through the Knights Templar and other things, we get what we call the European Hermetic Renaissance, which is so powerful it almost takes over the Catholic Church. There is one pope who is a Hermetic scholar. His room is sealed today. He is one of the Borgia popes. Now, after the Inquisition, the Templars continued to build. We have a lot of their buildings. They owned tremendous amounts of land, and they still do. The Templars groups did. They had other names, like they were called the Knights of Christ, and they had other kinds of names in different places. But these are all buildings that are Templar buildings that are well known today, and they're still going in England and other places. I went by Temple, what is this called? Temple
Church.
Temple Church, yeah, in London, yeah, when I was in London. And now the most interesting piece is the piece about Rosslyn Chapel. I devote a whole seminar to this because it's very important, because you see, the origins of Freemasonry supposedly happened in the 17th century. As we know it today, what's called speculative Freemasonry, which is people are Masons who are not building with stone. They don't do anything. They're not operative Masons. They're doing philosophy and weird things. But in Rosslyn Chapel, we have evidence that this was going on a couple of centuries before that even started up in England in that way. Rosslyn Chapel is built on the model of a Templar cross, and it was a Gothic building with flying buttresses and things. It was built in, I believe, the 1400s, something like that, by a family that are descendants, for the Sinclair family, that are descendants of actually the Merovingian family that was in charge of the Priory of Sion. These people are quite logically call themselves the successors of the Merovingian kings. And the family that lives there now, the royal family that lives there now, they're very wonderful people. They're very modest, and they are trying to keep things together. They've reestablished a Templar order and done a lot of things, but it's very interesting to go there, and I spent a lot of time there. And if you go see the module on Rosslyn Chapel, you'll see the movies I took there and different kinds of things. They were very associated not only with the building trades who built this building for them, but with the gypsies, who were from India. Gypsies were people who had exodused from India in the 8th and 9th centuries, come to areas that we now know of as Bohemia, etc., and were not accepted because they were dark-skinned. They were considered to be, there was a racist sort of thing, and they had very different religions and things. They worshipped a black female idol they put up, which today a lot of them are called the Black Virgin Marys, but they're actually Kali. And other people associated with Mary Magdalene and things like that. But these people were protectors of the gypsies. There's a whole museum at Rosslyn Chapel about the relations with the gypsies and how the Templars, the Templar families there protected them and gave them protection from all kinds of authorities and things like that, and obviously learned things from them. And the family that lived there, Scottish family, became part of, it's right outside of Edinburgh, so it's not very far from all the major sites in Scotland. And they built this as a place of worship. There's a Templar graveyard just maybe a half a mile away, full of Templar crosses and Templar symbols and all kinds of things. If you see the seminar on Rosslyn Chapel, you'll learn all about this. So the Sinclair family was responsible for building this originally, and they still are in charge of it. They brought builders from the descendants of the Comocene builders in Europe to come and build this for them, because most people did not have a tradition of masonry. The great knowledge of building in stone was kept by the Roman orders of building, the Roman building orders that had retreated after the invasion of the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries up into the Alps, and there they built a defended city. And there they also were called upon not only by Christians, but by Muslims and other people to come and help them build their great buildings. And so they had preserved these traditions. And that's where you went to go, just like for the building the Temple of Solomon. Solomon had to go somewhere else. He had to go to other people to come and build his stuff. So I mentioned their relationship with the Gypsies and the relationship not only with the Masons as protectors, but we find that the first lord who built this was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge, Masonic Order. Now that was not because he was a builder, it's because he was a patron, and that means that there was something going on that was esoteric, something related from Templar things to others, and this of course was a Templar family. We find that the whole Freemasonic initiation is depicted in wall carvings from this, and this is an initiation that is very important and interesting because it's very ancient. It's not just something that was invented in the medieval period. It goes back to 2,000 years BC, Goes back to the mystery religions, the mystery cults, the elements of this. Here I've shown one picture of what the carving in stone looks like, and then I've shown you a line drawing of what it is. There's a fellow kneeling before a book, which is the Bible. He is hoodwinked. That means he's blindfolded. He's got a cable tow around his neck, which means that he's under the control of the other person. He has actually, you couldn't see it, but he probably has one shoe off and one shoe on, which is another characteristic of this. And you see the person behind him has got a Templar cross, and he's the person who's initiating. When you're initiated, your initiator is standing behind you. And so anyway, there's a lot of things to learn about this. Here we're finding this in a place that's couple hundred years before Freemasonry is supposed to have begun. So these ancient initiatic rites suddenly appear at the 17th century founding of English Freemasonry, and when you ladies become Masons, you will go through these rituals and understand them. I want you to understand the men's mysteries just like you understand the women's mysteries. And that's why I'm asking you to do this. It's not a requirement of anything. And it seems to suddenly appear out of nowhere that they're doing this. But it looks like they were doing it a lot longer ago. But it didn't come from the Masons. It didn't come from the building trades. They had 3 orders. They probably had, apprentices and sort of a middle order, and then the very top there were masters. And they had probably some sort of initiation, but not a spiritual initiation like this. So this shows that Masonic initiation was being done 200 years earlier than we had ever thought. And it shows a connection with the ancient Greek mysteries. So who would have that connection? The Templars, not the building trades. So in this place there's a Templar village adjacent with a graveyard, and they're all descendants of Scottish Templars that settled there and with their money. So you want to see a little bit more about this, you can look at the seminar. Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
In the world of Masonic scholarship, which I personally think is an oxymoron, but this connection is not found among any of the authors. They have certain ones that are recognized, like there's a lodge in England called Quattro Coronati, which is a premier research lodge. And I don't mean to knock those guys, but I think they're the premier guardians of the traditional interpretation of everything.
Yeah. And
so, but this particular connection, because I've been very interested in this, and I've been totally unsatisfied with all the work of the old boys in their, in their original, official history. And so never have I found anything written connecting the Masons from Lake Como as builders for the Templars into the St. Clairs. I know I haven't read the book. The St. Clairs have a book out, one of them does, that explains this, and it's received a tremendous amount of criticism from the scholarly community. And so I've got a lot more research to do there, but I just wanted to point out that this is a very unique and unorthodox interpretation. But this actually makes sense. And it's more in line with the maverick interpretation of history, of where the Masons come from and so on.
And you'll find that my interpretation of Jesus is not in line with the Catholic theology and all this. And Scottish, and it is an oxymoron in a sense, because Masonic scholarship, there were some very great scholars in Freemasonry, and they have written some great things, and they did not have access to this kind of information at the earlier time. And they were mainly interested in preserving the traditions that they were brought up with, which is this all starts in the 17th century and everything else. But as I go on the internet now, and I just use search words like Rosslyn Chapel and Freemasonry and things like that, I found there's a lot of lodges like Mother Kilwinning and Scotland and other that are doing a lot of research on this. You might want to try researching some of those lodges. Scottish lodges have a whole different take on this than the English lodges do. And remember, the Scottish lodges may be prior. Who knows about that? But so let's move ahead. The initiation ceremony of Freemasonry involves what we call the rite of destitution. You go into light and a new life, destitute of your property, of your medals, anything you have, rings and things are taken off. This is not really a proper photograph, it's the only one I could find on the web, but this is the idea is that you are blindfolded and you have removed all metals and all that sort of thing. This is part of the rite of Freemasonry. So you are blindfolded, and you are there's a cable toe. It's around your neck or around your waist. It's all different in different traditions.
I won't say too much, but this is a Master Mason
Yeah.
initiation, not
But-
an enter apprentice.
But you girls will not have to take off your blouses. That's okay. We don't do that. Oh, is that why you wanted to help? Anyway, and the breast or the shoulder has to be bare, and the knees are bare. And this is another form of initiation. It's a different one. He's got slippers on, but very often you go slipshod. But there's also the rite of discalciation, with the one shoe on, one shoe off. Somebody ran through town with one shoe on, one shoe off. All those old fairy tales actually mean a lot of very interesting political things and so on.
That's supposed to come from the Book of Ruth.
Is
where
that?
a guy plucks off a shoe and gives it to a neighbor. That's like today a handshake or a signed contract. That's what they say. I wasn't
It is.
around at Ruth's time.
Yeah,
so
no,
I can't-
that was a Hebrew custom. However, it was more ancient than that. The Greek forms of initiation into a new life, for example, Empedocles would wear one bronze shoe when he threw himself into the volcano for his to imitate the initiation of Heracles in fire. As he would leave his body behind, he would wear one shoe off, one shoe on. It's a very ancient thing. It's not only Hebrew, it's many other things. The Hebrew, it was used for making vows and things like that as well. And sometimes special slippers are used of some sort. And then very often you're barefoot, like a spiritual wanderer, a monastic. Now, how old are these forms? Well, they go back to a long time ago, a very long time ago. And we find them described in the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity. The rite of destitution, the breast bare, no metal, no coins, passage into death. The rite of discalciation meant originally in those forms wearing special slippers or one shoe only or a bronze sandal. It was bronze. So here's kind of a quick, dirty origin of speculative Freemasonry. We call it speculative because it's not operative. It's not people that are just coming out to work on building something. It's people that have joined it actually for protection. And there was a time when they had to join these lodges to protect themselves so they could meet. There was operative masonry and the building trades to begin with. And there was an alliance of the Knights Templar and the operative Masons before the Inquisition. And after the Inquisition, that alliance continued, and the Masons, the Templars who had succeeded in escaping and still had their money, also built their own kinds of things and so on. And we find them not only in Scotland, but in England. And we find them in Portugal. And we talked about the evidence of Rosslyn Chapel. If you go to Scotland, there are many, many places where you'll find Templar graveyards, where all the graves have Templar symbols on them, and they were Templar communities. In the 16th century, at the time of the Hermetic Renaissance, which we haven't discussed yet, there was a brotherhood, an esoteric Hermetic brotherhood called the Fratris Lucis, that consisted of men and women in Florence, Italy. And it means the brothers of light, and the women were called brothers as well as the men. And it was a lot of their money that was involved in bringing over Hermetic and other documents of the Renaissance to be translated, be bought from the Arabs and brought into Europe. And it was also them who were involved in, had been involved in financing and also in some of the first vestiges of science that came out in things like Columbus's voyages of discovery and the other voyages of discovery. And then there was the rise of the Rosicrucian movement. These were political idealists who wanted an ideal nation that was based on spiritual principles, and this came in about the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, this is all after the time of the Templars, and it's in the 17th century that finally that we have what we call speculative or modern Freemasonry.